Where We're From highlights the rich textures, histories, and experiences of the Asian, Pacific Islander, and Desi American community. Each episode is produced by students at San Jose State University.
Hey guys, it's City Gang, the podcast where we talk about Asian Americans. And today's episode, we're going to talk about Asian American representation in politics. But before we start, though, let's introduce ourselves. I'm Adi.
I'm Georgie.
I'm Aliana.
I'm Jared.
And I'm Juchan.
Thank you guys. But yeah, this episode we're going to talk about Asian American politics. Asian Americans have always been pretty not that big in politics, especially considering America's history. But in recent times, though, there has been more representation and more voting from Asian Americans. So, 2024 election, there was actually a big Asian American voter turnout with over 15% increase over 2020. And this election, there were a lot more Asian American candidates as well. But before we go into that, Jared, can you give us like a quick rundown of Asian American representation in American history?
Yeah, for sure. So, for a long time, Asian Americans were seen as quiet when it came to politics. Many didn't vote or speak up because of language barriers, cultural differences, or simply feeling left out. But now that's changing. During the 2024 election, we saw an increase in Asian American candidates running for local, state, and national office. The engagement from Asian Americans helped in the politics by raising awareness to communities who aren't that much aware about the importance of politics in the United States.
Okay, that's good to know. But are there any particular examples of these candidates?
Yeah, Derek Tran is a great example. He was the first Vietnamese American elected to Congress, and he represented and made history for Asian Americans. He encouraged many Asian Americans to engage in politics. His purpose for the Congress was to fight for a diverse electorate, which caught attention towards first and second generation immigrants. He contributed in many things for the Congress, but his imprint he leaves for his community. He never failed to honor who he is as an Asian American, but also honoring his word and addressing the policies for all Americans.
Thank you, Jared, for giving some backstory about Asian American politics in the past. But I'm gonna be going ahead and talking about the increase in representation in Asian Americans as politicians and as voters in 2024. So although Asian Americans are one of the fastest growing racial groups, we also face the most underrepresentation as elected officials. So, but the question is why? Some examples are Adina Ishi, who became the first woman of color and Asian American mayor of Berkeley, and Ki Jung was elected the first Indian American to serve as a U.S. Shadow Senator, and Andy Kim, who won the first U.S. Senate seat from New Jersey, becoming the first Korean American senator in U.S. history.
Oh, wow. I didn't know some of these candidates. That is great progress.
Honestly, before doing my research on this, I didn't know any of these candidates as well. I feel like Asian American representation is not something that's really publicized. But yeah. So, with that being said, with the 2024 election also came a shift in Asian American voters. Kamala Harris secured over 50% of Asian American voters in major swing states, and Chinese Americans also showed a shift in support on the Democratic side. Over 53% supported Harris, while 39% supported Trump. Having more Asian American representation in politics is necessary because it can help shape political outcomes. And having more Asian Americans and diversity as a whole in politics can help us challenge stereotypes and help us include more diverse related policies in society. And with all that information being said, Audie, I do have a couple questions for you. The first one being, how was this election different from the previous elections? And also, do Asian American politics typically align with the historically white majority or with the other minorities in America, given the racial history in the country?
Yeah, so there was a more shift to a lean into conservatism from the Asian American community, as opposed to previous election years. So like most Asian American candidates like Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy were also more Republican candidates, not Democratic. But we did have Kamala Harris on the Democratic side. But yeah, Republican Party is a party that historically appealed to white Americans, supporting ideas like patriotism, Christian identity, traditional values, all that stuff. And there was a noticeable shift in Asian American voting last year. Like many of them highlighted conservative, like traditional conservative rhetorics like lawlessness, most of which is like being referred to like crime and all that, and like more like underprivileged minority populations. And then I feel like Asian Americans were more, what do you call, closer to whiteness or conforming to whiteness in such a way that they were reiterating that they're the model minority and that they would not do such acts. And there was also support for Republicans regarding like business reforms because this administration has pushed for ease of doing business and having less like restrictions for corporations. And that's actually helping the Asian American community because a lot of them do actually work in the tech and engineering fields and actually come to America through visa programs uh, that actually help the tech companies. So it's actually good for them. And yeah, all these re reasons mirror what white America traditionally supported, but now we have Asian Americans supporting things like meritocracy over DEI, nuclear families, and like anti-wokeness.
So, Georgie, considering that in this election the main candidate was a mixed race Asian and Black woman, how did this affect dynamics of the election?
For Kamala Harris, there were many headlines that focus on different parts of her identity, such as being Indian, Black, and a woman. But these were positives for her on the most part. However, some people believed she neglected claiming her Indian identity. However, this was not her fault, but the contribution of mainstream media's portrayal of mixed race candidates. According to an analysis of Black press and mainstream coverage of Kamala Harris, the vast majority of coverage from both mainstream news platforms did not focus on her race, ethnicity, and gender, and when the articles did, her multifaceted identity was often analyzed separately, recognizing her as the first Black woman or first woman to run for vice president. On the other hand, Black press did recognize her intersectionality, highlighting her historical and cultural significance in this election. This framing of candidates in terms of racial identity can activate stereotypes and biases, affecting voter support. Mixed race individuals should be able to embrace different parts of their identities without facing backlash from the public. Their races shouldn't fully define what political actions they can take, including what support they can gather. Speaking of mixed race people, I wanted to ask how the affirmative action decision a year ago played a role in this election. How is it important in the election, Aliana?
So, the inclusion of Asian Americans in employment, education, and in politics, in this case, has been an ongoing battle for decades and is still a continuous battle today. The purpose of affirmative action is to decrease racial discrimination in all of these subjects. However, it is a big controversy for whether or not it actually diminishes racial discrimination or if it increases it. About half of Asian Americans support affirmative action, which are the Democratic voters, and the other half disagrees, which are primarily the Republican voters.
Wait, so I'm confused. So why is it affirmative action like such even a debate in the Asian American community, considering that we're the minorities in America?
So yeah, that's a really good question, Audie. But many Asian Americans have actually found the affirmative action clause to lead them at a disadvantage when it comes to universities and very selective colleges. While Asian Americans are considered the model minority, this leads them at a disadvantage in affirmative action because it leads to unrealistic expectations while also not being viewed as American enough. So kind of leaves them stuck in between the middle of being considered better than other minorities, but also not being the dominant race as well. And after the 2023 Supreme Court decision on to strike down race-conscious admissions, this became an issue for primarily Asian Americans because there were many concerns that it actually limited their chances of getting into prestigious schools.
I feel like being a model minority sounds like a positive thing, but it actually has a negative effects on Asian Americans. Being a model minority has discredited Asian Americans to fit in with other minorities, leading them to a disadvantage.
Yeah, that is true. But like, was there like an opposing opinions between the older and newer generation Asian Americans, or?
Yes, so actually, the older and younger generations do have generally a typical stance on affirmative action, and the older Asian Americans were opposed to affirmative action due to the fact many of them believe that education is a necessary means to gain success. And the younger generation of Asian Americans are kind of more divided on the subject. Some of them disagree with race-conscious policies, and others agree with the fact Asian Americans are positioned to drive a wedge between other underrepresented racial groups.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add that DEI was also a word thrown around in the election, and I wanted to talk about it briefly. DEI is a principle that stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in and is used in jobs, schools, and communities. However, many Asian Americans tend to be underrepresented and discriminated against, primarily in leadership roles. Going back to Asians being a model minority, it suggests Asians are generally successful, not really taking into account the racial barriers they face. An example is that many Asian Americans make up employees at tech jobs, such as Google, Meta, Apple, etc., but are less likely to have leadership roles, also including board members, vice presidents, CEO, etc. However, most non-white tech CEOs and executives are Indian American.
So, how does this fit into the racial stereotype?
So this fits into the racial stereotype because it actually creates a paradox with that being that while the majority of Asian Americans are underrepresented in leadership roles, this doesn't apply to all ethnic and subgroups of the Asian American communities. Although Indian Americans are more likely to have leadership roles, companies might try to use that and exploit their success as a way of saying their DEI for Asian American roles are complete. However, that is not true, and that should not be the policy whatsoever. Full and correct representation should be measured in equal opportunities regarding genders, roles, and all subgroups of a race. It should not be measured through a couple of high-profile CEOs of a company because that doesn't give accurate representation of a full racial group.
Interesting. How does DEI look like in politics?
So what DEI looks like in politics is that there's actually a risk of tokenism, meaning where political parties may nominate mixed race candidates to appear diverse without providing them with genuine opportunities to succeed. Such candidates might be placed in races with little chances of winning, maintaining the appearance of diversity without affecting substantive change. I find this to be really sad because that just goes to show that people are more worried about the racial having the looks of racial groups, but not really caring about their contribution to the election.
No, yeah, I agree. We need not only to give them voices, but also a chance to be heard and seen as more than just these visual tokens. Moreover, we need to continue embracing racial diversity in our politics so that we're able to give voices to each group. In the past, we have not seen much Asian representation in our politics, but slowly we are making a bigger splash in elections by being more involved as voters and as policymakers. We need to keep fighting to bring issues involving Asian Americans into light and represent them properly.
Yeah, it was so interesting because this election there was more Indian American representation. And this is especially surprising for me because I'm Indian American, and this gives me hope that we can have more representation for all Asian Americans in the future. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
And before we wrap up this episode, here are a few questions to consider. The first question being, how can Asian Americans in politics build relationships with other underrepresented groups to push for both racial and economic justice? Also, what challenges do Asian American political candidates face in gaining recognition and support within both their communities and in an overall election? And the last question being is what are the main differences in the older and younger Asian American generations that affect political engagement and representation? And with all that being said, these are just some questions to think and reflect about after listening to our podcast today. Tune in for a third and final podcast as we talk about the 2023 Maui fires. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Where We're From. This podcast is produced by students enrolled in Dr. Joanne Rondilla's Asian American Studies courses at San Jose State University.